Hi everyone, this is the third session for the FEDSA mentorship program. My name is Martin. I'm a full stack web developer as well as a mentor for FEDSA. Last week we had a look at CSS Flexbox, and this week we'll be looking at Grid. Let's get started. Okay, so last week we had an in-depth look at Flex, and we actually even built out a cool little app. The link was provided to all the students so that they could actually follow along while we were actually explaining all the different properties that there are to do with Flex. Be sure to go and check out that last video. In the description for the video is a link to that app. The user interface isn't so great at the moment. We've just been a bit short on time, but we will be improving all of that and hopefully build out quite a nice set of different apps that you can play around with so that you've got a hands-on approach when it comes to learning. In our session last week, we also spoke about the different ways to think about Flex and Grid, or when you should be using Flex and when you should be using Grid. And sort of the general consensus is that when you need to be using Flex, you're looking for a one-directional layout. So for example, just on the X plane or the Y plane, whereas with Grid, you can position things on the X plane as well as the Y plane. So, what does it actually that mean? We don't have to be looking at complex mathematics and all of that. It's just easier to be using X and Y planes to explain things. And this is what we're talking about. If you have a look at these pink squares here, you can see that it flows in one direction like this. Now, if we were to add another item to this pink container, with the flex wrap property, this item is going to automatically go and wrap to the next line. And if we keep adding them over and over, it's going to get to the end, and then as you can guess, it's going to also wrap to the next line. So this content is actually only flowing in this direction. Then it gets to the next line. Even though it looks like they're actually positioned vertically here, that's just how they look right now. That's not how we've actually positioned the content. That's just an effect of the content wrapping to the next line. Now, Grid is actually going to be using an X and Y plane. So that means that we could actually position content going across like this, and we can actually also position content going up and down. And so that's why we will say that Flex is going to be using a one-directional layout, where Grid has got a two-directional layout, where you can actually go sideways and you can actually go up and down. Right, so I'm going to switch to Microsoft Excel now, because that's sort of a good way to try and demonstrate sort of how the cells work. Okay, so this is Microsoft Excel, which is just like a spreadsheet program. We don't have to be using Microsoft Excel here. You could be using any kind of Excel spreadsheet program for what I'm trying to demonstrate here. The main thing is that we just want to be having these columns, and you want to be having these rows, right? And that's the same thing that Grid is going to be working on, where you've got columns and you've got rows. And when I say Grid, it's sort of like the same thing as at school, when I'm sure you drew those graphs where you had, for example, you had Y that goes up and down, and then you had X that went across like this. And then you possibly had a plot a line that goes across, or like a parabola and all of that. So it's the same thing basically. You're not going to have all that complex mathematics, right? So the reason why I've actually got the spreadsheet program here is that we can actually go and sort of visually create what would normally show in when you're using CSS Grid. So let's just go and sort of create like a 3x3 grid here. So I've got 3 columns here that I've made the same size, and I'm just going to go and make these a bit bigger here. Okay, so let's put an outline on this. Okay, so now we've got a border. This is now the same as if we had our CSS Grid. We're going to have, it's going to be 3x3. So 3x3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And you've got your columns, and then you've got your rows. And then to reference your items, you're going to be able to go and say, we want it to be using starting column A, and then put an item in and make it grow all the way to column C. Then for the rows, we might say to it, we want to start at row 1, and we want to make it grow to row 2. And so now then we end up with a div that is now taking the size of, we're taking our div is spanning over these different cells to ultimately get almost what is like a new size. So then if we actually had another div container and we actually started it at 2, and then, sorry, started at A for our columns, and we took it down to, let's actually take it down to B, and that would be a different color. And then we wouldn't be able to grow it any further because that's where our grid ended. So then that's basically how you would actually start laying items out. And just using Excel, so you can see that it's quite easy for us to just sort of get a visual representation of how we would typically be using grid. Okay, so now I'm going to be switching to CSS, and I'm sorry I've been boring you with Excel and Photoshop and all of that, but that's just to sort of help to visualize it a bit better. So now let's jump to the code and actually start maybe building something out similar to this. Okay, so now we in VS Code now, and we just got a sort of a bare bones index file, and that's just with the emit. Let me just quickly show you. We have covered this in the past, but just in case you didn't know, exclamation mark, push tab, and then you've got sort of your little snippet that's added that generates a normal HTML page, and then importing just a basic CSS file that I've got a grid container that isn't actually set up for grid. This is just so that it's pre-start. I don't have to start it on the video and sort of waste your time. So I'm going to start by adding in just a div here, and I'm going to show you just a quick trick where you could just type in the element you want, right? And this is only going to be working in HTML. And just click this area so you can actually see what it's actually going to be doing. And so when you type in div, if you actually go and put dot, you can now actually give it a class name. And I want to give it this grid container class name. Right, so I've got the grid container. Now you can actually see over here what it's actually going to be generating when I push tab. This is like an emit. So I'm going to push tab, and now I've actually got this grid container as a div, and I'm going to save. And here we go. Okay, so we got this grid container in the background here, but I'm going to take out the background. I don't want the background color. Right, and let's inspect the document so that we can see what's going on with the CSS. Okay, great. Right, so let's start adding display grid. So this past month we've basically been speaking about all the different display types. We first started with block and inline block, and then we did flex. Now we're doing grid. So grid is another one of the display types where you end up with a very dynamic display. So let's go and add it in display grid. And before I push save, I'm just going to show you something here. Right, here is in our dev tools. This is called your dev tools. You can see here is our div container here, also our grid container. And it's just pretty much a div. There's nothing sort of special about it. We don't have this saved yet. That's why there's a white dot here. It's not saved yet. Let me just take it out so that it's not saved. So there's sort of nothing special about this. But when I add grid, there's going to be a new little button that's going to appear here, which is really great when you're working with grid as well as flex. Flex also will show you this button. So let's uncomment this and save the file. Okay, now the little white spot's gone. That means it's saved. Now you can see over here, there's this little button. So you can click that, and now it's actually showing us a visual representation of the grid. You don't see anything just yet because we don't actually have anything in our grid, so it's got nothing to really show us yet. But over here are numbers that are going to correspond with our columns and our rows, just the same as the way that I showed you in the spreadsheet here. We're going to have A, B, C, D, and 1, 2, 3, 4. There's going to be numbers that are going to be for our different cells in the grid container. Okay, so let's go and start adding templates. Adding columns and rows. When it comes to your grid, you generally know how many columns and rows you're going to want to have in your grid. You can have it generate rows and columns depending on your content, which we will possibly be looking at later. But most of the time, you're going to know whether you're going to want 2 columns or 5 rows and all of that. You know, in comparison to Flex, where there you're just going to be dropping divs in. You don't actually care about, you don't actually specify to Flex, look, we're going to have only 8 divs, so make yourself only 8 cells wide. We don't generally do that with Flex. That's the great thing about Flex, is you can just go and put a div in and stick another div, stick another div, and it's not really going to care. It will find its way around it. where most of the time with grid, you're going to want to go and specify, we need to have 2 columns and 5 rows, right? So how do we actually go about specifying columns and rows in grid? So that is with the grid template property. And you've got grid template columns, and you've got grid template rows. These are exactly the same, sorry, except one impacts the columns and one impacts the rows. So how do we go about using this? Basically, what we do is we add a measurement for each column that we want to have. So let's say we wanted to have a column for 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 100 pixels, and save that. We're actually going to have a column for 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 100 pixels. You can possibly see that there's more numbers that have been added here, but because we don't have any rows yet, it hasn't expanded out, so we can't see it. So let's just quickly add the rows in. So let's go grid template rows and say 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 100 pixels. Okay. So now you can see we've actually got a 9 by 9 grid because we've got 3 times by 3 and 3 times 3 is 9. Okay. But this doesn't really help us. We actually want our grid container to fill out its parent container. Like the contents must fill out the parent container. So what we're going to use then is fraction measurements. And we covered that in the Flex last week's session where we discussed Flex. And what fraction or FR is, what that does is it takes the spacing and it divides it up to however many items there are. So let's actually do that. So I'm going to go and change this from 100 px to 1fr. Save it. Okay, so now you can see it's actually spanned it across. And it's gone and basically said, I want the first one to share the same size with all 3 of these. Sorry, let me word that a bit better. What it's doing is there's the space that's available, and it's dividing it equally amongst these that have got 1fr. So it's just basically dividing it 3 ways, right? So let's now do the same thing with the rows. Save. Okay, so now it's actually occupying the entire space, and that's sort of what we want to have here. There is actually a CSS function that I feel that now is probably a good time to go into, and that is the repeat. So instead of going and writing all of this out, we can actually have a repeat function. So say this was all going to be exactly the same. With coders, as a coder, you don't want to be repeating yourself. Generally, the rule is that if it starts, like you get to your 3rd instance, then you want to start looking at some kind of function or something that can rerun your code, right? So instead of having all of this, we could actually have repeat, and now we're putting brackets because it's a function. Functions typically go in your parentheses like this. And the first, it takes 2 values. The first one is how many times you wanted to actually repeat. So what did we have there? I think we had 5. So we're going to repeat it 5 times. And what do we want to repeat? So we actually wanted to repeat the 1fr. So save it. And nothing's actually changed here because it's actually the exact same thing as this. Like that's why you're not seeing any change. It's because when I saved it, it's doing the exact same thing that we had. So we can actually go and do the exact same thing here. Repeat 5 times, 1fr. Let's just take all of that away. So, and there we go. So it's doing the exact same thing. I'm going to undo this though because we might want to be modifying the different values that are in here. Okay, so we've got our grid added, and now we actually want to start adding items to our grid. So the way we do that is we would just add a normal div. So let's just go and add a div here. Div dot, we'll just call it item 1. Push tab, so we can have that div in there. But you're not going to sort of see anything yet. We're going to have to go and first just give it a background color. Item 1 background and light sea green. Save it. Okay, so there you can see we've actually got this div and it's popped in. We've actually specified no values for it at all, because the way that it works is that each time you're adding an item in here, what it's going to do is it's going to go and just give it to this next logical position. So for example, there's the first one, there's the second one, there's the third one, and then there's the 4th one. Where grid gives us the power to move and span wherever we want. it's not going to know if you haven't told it where to put it. So it's just going to think, okay, the only logical thing I really can do is just put them in sort of like a successive order, so they come right after each other. So I'm going to take these other ones out, and let's look at actually positioning this grid item to something different. Let's go across up to maybe number 5, and then maybe let's go down to this row over here. Okay, so the way we do that is we say grid column start, and then you got grid column end. Then you've also got the row equivalent of this, so let's just copy that and change this to row. And what I'll do in the meantime is just take out the rows for now. Okay, so we've got grid column start, and so this is the number where we actually want to start. So if I had it as 1 here, so I'm going to save it like that. If I have column start at 1, it's going to start here. And then if I have column end, it's going to end here, but it won't sort of be completely void. It's not going to disappear completely. So that's why you don't see it just being a straight line, because it's always going to be occupying a cell. So let's actually go and change our start position to maybe 2, and then let's change our end position to 4. So it will start here and it's going to end at 4 over there. So let's go save it. Okay, so there you can see it's now starting at 2, this number here, and it's going up to 4. Now let's go and add some rows in so that it actually goes down. And as you probably picked up on now, this is where we've got that sort of 2-dimensional layout with grid. We can actually lay stuff out sideways, and we can lay stuff up and down. Okay, so grid row start is going to be where we want to start. Let's push the stuff down completely. So let's start at number 3 over here. So we're going to start at 3, and let's end at this line over here, number 5. Yeah, I'm going to save it. And there we go. So now you can see it's the rows started at number 3, and it's pushed down the content all the way down to number 5. Okay, so I'm just going to reset this back to the start. Okay. Now, during the session we had Jonathan, he was asking, no, well, what about these negative numbers? What do these things mean? So the negative numbers are where the grid is actually starting from the other side. And what that's going to let you do is instead of going and counting or spanning your content over these numbers, for example, your column ends using these numbers, you could instead use the negative numbers. So let's say we actually want to go up to -3. It's got the same effect. But there's actually something that is great about this, and that is -1 is always going to be the end of either your column or your row. So for example, column end, let's do -1. And then if we do row -1, here's the minuses for the rows. It's going to go all the way to the end. And so this is an amazing sort of feature to have in JavaScript. For example, in the arrays, you can't just use like a little function or whatever to get the end of array. You actually always have to use like array length -1. If you don't know JavaScript, don't worry about that. But the point is that it hasn't got that built-in functionality, and in the new spec for JavaScript, they're going to be adding that functionality. So it just goes to show that having such a feature is amazing. And in Grid, we've actually got that type of functionality by -1. So you can always get your content to the end of your grid by using -1. Okay, so that's the basics of positioning your items, giving it the columns and rows that they need to span to. But we can actually go and improve that by using Shorthand. I'm sure that if you've been using CSS, you've come across Shorthand before. And basically what it does is it combines multiple different properties into one so that it's a lot easier to write. And the first thing we're going to do here is that we can actually combine this grid column start and grid column end with just grid column. Yeah, so this grid column is now shorthand for this grid column start and grid column end. And the way that it works is that you put your first value here, your start value. So let's go start, and then you put a slash, and then you do or then you put the end value. So this is the exact equivalent of this. It's not different at all. It's exact same. I'm actually going to save it here, and then I'll show you when I actually drop this down. You'll see it says here grid column start and grid column end. And this happens with many other CSS properties. You can actually go, for example, look at the background here. I actually drop it down and it's already gone and set all of these other values, and it's only just gone and set this background color. Right. Okay, so with this grid column, let's go and actually do row here quickly. I'm going to also set it to something a bit simpler, so it's not taking up the entire table, because then we can't really do much with it. Okay, let's go down a little bit further. Okay, great. So we got it. We're going across here and then we're going down. Okay, so then just something I wanted to touch on before continuing is when it comes to knowing how to count your cells and your lines, because it can end up catching you out a little bit, and especially since with generative programming you start at 0, whereas we're starting with 1. Let's say that you wanted to have 3 cells colored in. You wouldn't go 1 and then you want 3 cells, so you'd put 3. You actually need to count the lines. So you would start at 1, count to 2, count to 3, and then count to 4. So in your mind, you'd sort of hopping over each cell, and then you would know that, okay, now I've got enough to actually give me my 3 cells. So just to try and keep that in mind, it should sort of help you from having to fiddle too much with your CSS. So the next thing we're going to be looking at here is spanning the content over. Right now, we're having to say that, okay, we wanted to stop at column 4 and we want our row to stop at row 3. But, what if we don't really know the numbers, or we don't want to mess around the numbers? We actually just want to say, look, we only want it to be 2 cells big and we only want the rows to be 3 rows big or whatever. Then we can actually use a span keyword. So let's say we add span in here, but we only want it to span 1. Actually, let's keep it so it's the same as it is now. We actually want it to span 3. So here's 1, here's 2, here's 3. So we're spanning 3, and I'm going to save it. So let's say we wanted the 4th one. We're starting here, and we want it to span this 1, 2, 3, 4. So then we'd span 4 like that, right? So span is sort of counting the cells, where usually when you're doing the columns, column end, you're going to have to consider that you're actually counting the lines, not the cells. Okay, and this also applies for the rows. So at the moment it's spanning 2, because we're starting at 1. So there's 1, we're spanning 1, we're spanning another. So if we wanted to use span here to cover the two cells or the 2 rows, we would say span 2. Yeah. Okay, so the next one we're going to be looking at is you can, instead of using these numbers, you can actually give them names so that it's more meaningful to you as a programmer, right? So the way we do that is using square brackets when you're actually creating the template columns, the columns and the rows. So let's just go and do this for the columns. When you actually give it the names, it's actually giving the lines the names, not the cells, right? So it's important because later on I'll be showing you that you can also give your cells names, right? So for the names, we're going to start you at the beginning. So this will be the very first line, and let's just say first line. Then let's do second line, third line. I guess let's just end it there. Okay, so now to test that this works, let's go and instead of going and using the numbers, let's now actually use these sort of aliases that we've given it. Okay, so I'm going to take away, I'm actually going to just, I'm not going to use span, I'm just actually going to do the column end. So we got 1 and we're going to want it to end, let's do the second line. So that's just going to be sort of 1 cell that's covered. So we write in second line, save, and see it's actually working. If it actually was incorrect and I saved, you'd see it actually go all the way across. So by knowing that it's actually only stopped at that, I can tell that it's actually working. So let's go and change this to third line. And there you go. So you can see it's actually, it's spanning, well, not spanning, it's guess it is spanning to the line that where we want it to end. And let's just count the lines here. So we've got the first line, it's first line. Then we've got second line, which is the second line. And then we've got the third line, which is this third line here. Right, so it's not actually really impacting your code in any way. It's not actually programmatically changing anything over here. It's still like the same grid. But as a developer, we try and give things meaningful names so that someone 6 months down the line, they could sort of have more sense, make more sense of it. With that all being said, you're not going to often come across this, generally, because it's not hard to count the numbers where you need to be. And if you can actually see in the dev tools, those numbers aren't actually being reflected here in the grid. Maybe at some later stage, sorry, these names aren't being reflected here. Maybe at a later stage they will go and start adding it so you can see the names here. But as far as I know at the moment, these names aren't going to appear in the grid. So it's not really providing a ton of benefit, but we've got to cover it just for the sake of completion. Okay, so let me just clean up the aliases we created for the lines, and just clean that up as well. And now let's do the equivalent, but actually for the cells. So the aliases for cells. So what we can actually do, let me just jump to Excel here quickly. If you remember, we created a cell that goes like this. So it goes from column A all the way to column C, and then it goes from row 1 to row 2. Now, that's not really reusable. If we wanted to sort of put a different element in here and take this element out, we can't. We'd have to go and add those starting and end points for that other div. So what we could actually instead create in our grid is areas. So we would define it similar to the way that we would for a cell, except it's actually just going to be an area. So for example, we create an area that's this exact sort of start and end points, but then we could actually just assign a div to that area, and then it will automatically grow to the size without you having to say what the start and end points are. So let's have a look at that. To do this, we use grid template areas. Sorry about tooltips there. Grid template areas. Okay. So we start with grid template areas, and what we do here is we basically give it a bunch of letters or a bunch of words or letters to indicate where that cell belongs to. And you want to match up your exact layout like this. So this is actually going to be a visual representation tool, well, not just a visual representation tool, but it also gives you the advantage of laying out your areas so that it matches your table, and then it's sort of easier to digest what exactly is going on there. So the way we do that is we first open our quotation marks there, and let's just start with letters, just to start off with. Okay, so we're going to actually need to match this exactly with this. So what I'm not going to want to have to do all of these cells. So let's just sort of dumb it down a little bit. Let's just go with like a 3x3 grid. Okay, and I'm just going to make, so that's, we didn't have that name anymore. Okay, so then after this, we will go and add the next row, and then finally the last row. Okay, so now we've actually gone and created areas for our grid. So what you could have actually possibly had here instead of these letters is like header, 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 and then main, 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 and footer, 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 right? So now that we've got these areas, we can actually go and instead of going and saying where the start and end points are, we can actually just go and say grid area and just say the thing it needs to be. Okay, so now I don't have to specify a start or endpoint. It's automatically going to go and span itself across this. So let's just go and say we wanted to make it B. We save it. Now you see it's actually become B. And then you can become C. So what I'm actually going to do is just change this to header. Just so it makes a bit more sense. And then footer. Okay. And we'll make this header. Okay, so it's back to how it was. We're not using those letters anymore. But now I want to make things a little bit interesting here. So let's actually add. Should we go add more rows or columns? I'd like to add more rows. Okay. So now we're gonna have 4 rows going down. But now we've got our main. Now actually, sorry, we got our header there. So let's actually go and add a new item here. So I'm going to add this as item 2, right? And then I'm going to say grid area instead of header. I'm going to call this main. I'm going to save it, and I'm going to have to add it here. And then I'm just going to change the color. Let's go with that lighter color like that. And we're going to have to fix this up here because now we're not matching. Okay, so now main is now these the 2 rows there. And then lastly, we're going to have our footer, which can be item 3. And we're going to have footer. Okay, we've just got to add this in here. Okay, so now we've got, let's put that back on. So now we've got our header, then we've got our footer, our main, which is now spanning 2 rows, and then we've got our footer down at the bottom. Okay. So let's make things a little bit interesting. Let's now add a sidebar in here. So instead of that main here, we're going to have a side and a side. And we can go and add another item in here. And we'll call this side. So we've got that added as side there. And then we just got to add this item in since it's not actually there. And we're going to have to give it, I think we have to start switching the colors up here a little bit. Okay, so we've actually got the sidebar. Right, so that's like really cool. So now we've actually got these areas and we didn't have to specify the start point or the end point. And if we wanted to go and grow this out, so let's just say we added another row here and we wanted to expand this, everything's going to now automatically sort of compensate or adjust to what we've actually, those changes we made there. So it's easy to just go and modify it from here now without actually touching other classes. But then you're going to ask, what if I actually don't want to have all of this to be sidebar? What if we actually only want to have, sorry, let me just put the representation. What if we only wanted there to be 2 cells and this one must just be empty? There must be nothing in there. And what we do with that is we just actually add a dot here and then save it. Okay, so now our side isn't actually occupying this because it's this dot means it's like a I won't say a wildcard, it's just a nothing. So there's nothing that's actually going to be occupying the space over here. Okay, so that's the grid template areas. I'm going to now just revert these changes and we're going to go back to having specifying the different areas that they want to go, because there's a little bit more, a couple of more tricks that I can actually show you in regards to that. So let me just start reverting this. Okay. Okay, so great. Right, so the next one is going to be another shorthand. Now, so previously we had grid columns. Other tooltip. So we just had grid columns, and then you can also have grid row, which is the combination of the start and end. The next one is going to be a combination of your grid columns and your grid rows. And I should have actually covered this earlier, but it slipped my mind. So you can say grid. Let's get rid of that. So grid area, I think it's grid area, lets you specify the start point the endpoint for, I believe it is the columns first, and then, actually, no, I think it's the rows first. Then the start point and the end point. So let's just see if it tells us here. Yeah, there we go. So shorthand for grid row start, grid column start, grid row end, grid column end. Sorry, so I had it wrong there. So the 2 are the start positions and the other 2 are the end positions. So let's go with 1, 1. So it's grid row start. Actually, so I'm gonna make it go down in the middle over here. So we'll go with 3, and then we want it to be on the left side. So that's 1, and then row end, we'll just drop it down 1. So let's go with 4, and then I would actually like this to go all the way across. So that's gonna, let's just go with a -1 here. Save it. There you go. Okay, so let's just disable these other ones so that they're not distracting us. And I'll put the grid back on. Okay, so you can see how that this is now the start of the row, then the start of the column, which is the 1 up there, then the end of the row, which is this 4 here, and then the end of that, the column. And we're using -1 so that, sorry, across like this. We're using -1, which is down here, so that it goes all the way across. Otherwise, we could have just gone and said 4 there. So we could also just, this is the equivalent 4. So 4 is where it's going to end, or -1 for the complete end position. Okay, so we've got that. The next one we're going to be looking at is the grid gaps, which is spacing between the column, the row, or combination of both. So this used to be called grid gap, but if I remember correctly, it's actually been changed. And grip, so you can actually see that there's actually sort of a line drawn through it. So it's still going to work if you say grid gap, but it's actually not called grid gap anymore. It's now just gap. And if I add my gap here, you can see there's now this gap being applied. But it's not going to do anything for what we currently got at the moment, Joe. You're going to see it is going to sort of squash it down because it's making more spacing, but it's not actually going to do anything because this is one element. This gap is going to be between different elements. So for us to see this effect, we actually need to be adding more elements to the grid. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to go and just re-enable these. Enable those divs. So there you can see it's being applied there. And then this one over here, let's just take this out completely. So now because we're not specifying anything, they're just sort of getting popped in as like the order they come in, and then they only occupy one cell. So there they're all going in, and now you can see we've got our column gap and we've got our row gap. So as you can see here, here's the CSS. So let's just copy that and just be a little bit lazier and just paste it in. Save. Exact same thing as this. This is a shorthand that combines these two together. So for rows, let's go with something like big so it's visible, and then this one will make a lot smaller. So you can see there's our column gap is 15 pixels. Let's put that back on. Column gap is 15 pixels, so it's a lot smaller. And then we've got our row gap, which is 45 pixels. And then for interest sake, what if, I'm sure you've asked yourself now, what if I want a gap on the outside? Well, then we're not going to be using grid gap. Then that's just basic container logic we're going to be using there. So we would just add padding to the container. So padding, and then let's just add 25 pixels. Okay, so there you can see now it's actually added the padding. We turn the grid off so you can see it's added the padding in. You can see it's also forced the content to create the scroll bars, which is because this is now pushed over. That's because of the box model, and we haven't got it to set it to border box, so that the padding in that is calculated in for the total size of the container. So all you have to do here is just say box sizing, border box, save it. There you go. So now it's not doing it anymore. Then that's just because the padding is getting calculated as the total width of the box, not the width of the box, and then padding gets added afterwards, and then that's why it's pushing it's sort of overflowing and creating the scroll bar at the bottom. Okay, so the next parts we're going to be looking at is aligning content. So either aligning all of the items in a column, all of the items in a row, or those aligning those items individually. And this is similar to justify and align content that you would normally see in Flex. Okay, so let's just start cleaning up here a little bit. And just take out gaps. Great. And then I just want to go and start adding some outlines here. I'm just going to be adding outlines, and then I'll just go and add this to everything. Okay, so now that we've got those outlines, they actually make it a little bit bigger. Okay, so now we can just distinguish where they start and end. Right, so the first one will be justify self, which is actually, sorry, no, let's actually start with justify items. We'll start with the ones that apply to all of them, and then we'll work our way down to them being applied individually. Okay, so to start off with, we're just gonna have to size these containers so that we can see the effect that's taking place here. Let's maybe go a little bit bigger than that. Oops. Okay, great. So you can see that in the top left corner for each of them. Now what we can do is we can have all of the items either along the horizontal axis or the vertical axis get moved the same way that with Flex we could either allow them to Flex start or Flex end. Instead we're going to be using start and end now. So the first one we're going to do is we're going to do justify items. Now if you remember from the Flex video, when we are using justify, that's on the horizontal plane. For example, justify items is going to be a longer word than align items, and that's sort of like a nice easy way to remember it. So justify items, and we're going to just go and say start. Okay, well that's going to not do anything because we already are at the start there. So let's try and move it to the end, and there you can see. So what's happening here is it's moving along on the horizontal plane. So imagine, for example, where this 2 line is here, it's here would be 0 or to start. So let's just put it on start here. On this horizontal line, it'll be at the start here, and then it moves over here, and that's the end. So just remember that justify is a longer word than align, so it's always going to be horizontal. So justify items, we've got start, and then we've got end, and then we can even do it in the center. Okay. Then we got the same thing with align items. Let's disable that and get it for its default. So nothing's happening here because we've got it at the start. Justify items is horizontal, so align items is going to be vertical. And when we go to the end, there you can see they have moved now. All of them have moved down. Okay. Then we can also put this in the center, and then they're all centering. So there is now a combination or shorthand that's added in Grid, which is slipping my mind right now. Is it place? I think it's place. Yes. Okay. So we had justify items and then align items, and now we can combine those two to become place items. So if we go place items, and let's make it start. So this is going to be the beginning. Nothing's going to happen there. Then we're going to go end, and that's going to put them in the corner over here, because horizontally the end will be over here. This would move over there, and then vertically it will move down there because that's the end there. So place items end. There you can see it's moved to the corner. That's really going to be that useful most of the time, but the center one is, oh, that's awesome. So this is just like a really, really cool one, and I feel like if you do this, people will be a bit impressed if you are using sort of a shorthand like this. It's like a one that you don't often see. Okay, so let's move on to the next part. And the next part will be justify content. But this isn't going to work right now because our grid is a full size like this. So let's just get our grid to be a little bit smaller. Okay, so it's a little bit squashed like this, and let's do the same over here. I don't think we need to have all these rows, so let's also reduce that. Okay. So now we've actually got our grid container sort of in this container, but now what if we actually want to move this entire container around the screen? So that is now where justify content is going to come into the picture. So I'm going to take out this place items, don't need that anymore, and I'm going to justify content. So at the moment, yeah, it's at the default, which I think is going to be start. Yeah, so obviously start. So let's set it to end. So now you can see the entire grid is actually moved. So what we were doing previously was it was justify items and align items. I guess I will keep it there just so we can see it. Now we're justifying content. So items are the items inside the grid, and content is sort of the whole thing. So if you sort of want to imagine content, remember when we had that that setup earlier where it was, we had, let's just do it like this. We had header, 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 and instead of main, we'd have content, 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 and then we'd have footer, footer. Whoa, what are you going? What are you doing there? And then footer, footer, footer. Content is usually where all of your stuff is contained inside. You know, your header is going to be the same, but you're going to be generating your content inside the content. So content is typically this container that's got all of your content inside it. So that's sort of a way that you can just sort of remember that. So justify content is going to be moving. Once again, justifies on the horizontal plane, because let's just look at them together here. Look, justifies a longer word than align. So justifies across, align is therefore going to be like this. I'm just sort of going over this more than once because for the longest time, I couldn't remember which is which. So just remember that justify is a longer word, so therefore it's going to be on the horizontal plane, and align will actually be on the vertical plane. Okay, so we've got our justify content, and as you know, when you put it to the end, it goes to the end. Then if we do align content, it's now going to be on the vertical axis. So let's do start as the default, so it's not going to do anything. Then we can go center, and then we can also go on the end. And then once again, we've got that combination where you can combine those two, and don't know if you guessed it, but we can place. So we can place content and combine them all together. So now that's justifying and aligning the content. So I'm going to undo all of this and get us back to sort of where we were. And I also am going to want this to go back to, there we go. Right, so we've covered how all of the items get shifted around. Same way that it can happen in Flex. But now we can actually also go and individually move each of the items just in the same way that you can with Flex. And that's going to be with the self. Okay, so let's start with we just use this first one here. So once again, you've got a line. We'll go line self, and we automatically, I think it's on auto, that's the default. Is it stretch? I believe it's the default. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to line self, but now let's actually move it to the end. And so what should happen is that we should have actually started on justify, not align, sorry. Okay, so we got justify and it's moving on the horizontal plane. And then you've got the same thing with align. And we can also combine the two so that we can place self center. So I'm going a bit quicker through self because it's the exact same thing as what we just covered, except it's applying to one individually. Okay, so that was the end of that part of positioning items using justify and align, either with the grid, all of the items in the vertical and horizontal axes, or individually. What we're going to be now looking at is generating items in a grid using some of the CSS functions available to us. The first thing I'm going to do is just clean up what we've got here. So It's a bit easier to work with. Great. Okay, so the first one we're going to be looking at is auto-filling the grid. And that basically means it's going to, where we've got these empty spaces here, these cells, it will go and generate as many as possible that it can, depending on the size that we've got. So right now, if you have a look at when I'm actually doing this, the size is getting smaller and bigger, and that's because it's one FR, but we could even make it 100 pixels, save it, and it's not going to change the size of our grid. That's just actually creating a bit of a visual problem there for us. Now, what if we actually made it that if we add this container as wide as it is here, we wanted it to go and fill in as many items as possible that are 100 pixels. So that's where the autofill comes in. So if you remember correctly, or remember earlier, we had the repeat. That's where we give it, let's just say 5 and 100 pixels. We can repeat the number of columns we want there, so to make it 6, and then it gets more like that. So we would want this to basically autofill, and that's the exact word we need to use here, is autofill. So I'm going to save. Now you're going to see that now we've actually got, I think it's eight columns here. And as it gets smaller, as the container gets smaller, it is now reducing the number of columns that we are. Sorry, that there are. Okay, and now the next one is going to be Autofit. And what that is it's going to only create as many columns as what you need for your elements in your grid. So if I had Autofit and there were 4 elements, 4 divs added in, it's only going to have 4 columns. If I had 6 divs, then it's going to have 6 columns. So let's change autofill to autofit. Save. There you can see there's 4 columns. So let's just add a new div, and you'll see that a new column gets created. So each time I'm saving, it's just restarting it. Save it again, and there's another one. So you can see Autofit is automatically adding as many columns as needed. And we don't just have to do columns, we can do the exact same thing for the rows. So let's just copy paste this. Don't think it's going to have any effect because we don't have enough rows here. So let's just turn it on. Yeah, so we don't have enough rows, so basically it just stops there immediately. So let's just go back to that. Great. Okay, so the next one we're going to be doing now is min-max. And sort of the name implies what it's going to do is you're going to have a minimum value allowed and a maximum value allowed. So let's just get this back to where we were, where we've got 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. Okay. So we're going to be applying this to the last column. So over here, instead of 1FR, we're actually going to go and say min-max. Open your brackets. Now it's going to take 2 parameters here. The first one is going to be the minimum size it's allowed. So let's go 250 pixels, and then the maximum size it's allowed. So most of the time, because we're not shrinking the page down, it's going to be 1FR. But then as we shrink down the page, if it gets to 250 pixels, this column is not going to be allowed to get below this value. Okay, so let's start shrinking this down. Okay, so you can start now seeing the effect. Look at the size of this and the size of this, and then you can see this is actually maintained as 250 pixels. So let's keep going. And okay, and eventually at this point, when the container starts pushing, and then can't really do much about that. So there you can see it's maintaining its minimum size that it's allowed. It's constraint. It's not allowed to go below that minimum size. Okay, now there's going to be one final set of properties here, and that's going to be the auto columns and auto rows. And what that's about is, imagine you were to include an item, but it's outside of the div, outside of your grid. So imagine we see you've got 1, and we end off with the line being 4. What if we had it start at 5 and it ended at 6? You know, what do we do about then? So let's go and delete these extra ones we've got here. And I'll create one and just say item extra. and we're just going to duplicate that and just call it item extra. And let's give it like a bad background, reds, or save that. Okay, so it's added in there, and now we're going to go and say grid column start. Let's make it, what did I say? We're going to do 6. Maybe it was 5. And then grid column end, make that 6. I think we should just do the same with rows so that we know exactly where it's going to be. Row. Oh, whoopsie. What am I doing? Okay. Okay, so as you can see here, we've sort of got problems that are happening. Let's make the grid bigger. You can see that it's gone and added. What else? Let's turn this min-max off so that things look properly. Okay, so you can see we've got our FRs here, but now when we've added that onto the end there, it's sort of done its own things in regards to size. We wanted maybe 1 FR. So what you can do with that is grid AutoColumns and grid AutoRows. Sorry, just getting late, making a couple of mistakes here. And we can go now and specify what we actually want the sizes are for our new columns and our new rows. So we had these previously as 1 FR, so we set these to 1 FR. We set those to 1 FR. Okay, so now you can see that when we've added it in, it's now gone and added. It's maintained at the size that we actually wanted it to have. So just to expand on this to show you how it's basically growing. Let's go, and instead of having 5 and 6, let's go a bit crazier. Let's go maybe 9, and then it ends at 10. So you can see now it's actually gone and created all of the rows that we needed, and it's now, this row over here has now got the 1 FR. Okay, so that's it for this week's session, which was on CSS Grid. Next week, we'll be looking at media queries, how they work, and how you could even manipulate your Flexbox containers with them to change the whole layout of your page. If you aren't aware, FEDSA, which is a non-profit organization, they hold mentoring sessions every Monday between 5 and 6 South African Standard Time. You can also join us in the FEDSA mentoring channel on the ZA Tech Slack server. I will pop the link in the description of the video, and you can come and get all the joining links and everything there to attend the sessions live. Great. Thanks for watching, and we hope it was helpful to you. See you around. Cheers.